said to be born on Christmas Day in 841 in Nuremberg, Germany. Almost nothing is known about Edmund. Records or any evidence of Edmund's life or reign were likely destroyed by Viking invaders. Accounts of his life were written some years later, possibly fictitious, stating that he was crowned as the King of East Anglia when he was 14 years old. It's also reported that he became a model king, kind to his subjects and generous with his wealth. A lot of these details were written by Abbot of Fleury, an abbot from France who, upon learning of King Edmund, decided to write a biography on his life. So many of these details are to be taken with a pinch of salt, but it's an interesting story nonetheless. During, before, and after King Edmund's reign, it was a troubled time in Britain, with Viking invasions coming frequently. After a successful and bloody campaign in Northumbria by two of Ragnar Lothbrok's purported sons, Ivar and Ubba Ragnarsson, Ivar, or Ivar the Boneless as he was also known, ventured south to the kingdom of East Anglia in the year 869. Ivar's nickname is said to have come from some kind of bone condition or inability to walk. Upon returning to his wife Austag after a long campaign, Ragnar Lothbrok wished to consummate his marriage. Austag, being a kind of clairvoyant, said that they must wait 3 nights before consummation in order to avoid a curse. Ragnar, however, did not wish to wait, and thus Ivar was born with his bone disease. Upon entering East Anglia, Ivar Ragnarsson sent a messenger to King Edmund. He suggested that Edmund submit to their rule and renounce Christianity. His messenger, according to Abbot of Fleury, said the following: "My august master, and unconquerable sovereign Ingvar, a terror by land and sea, having by force of arms brought countries into subjection to himself, has landed with a great fleet on the desirable shores of this territory with the intention of fixing his winter quarters here, and in pursuance thereof commands you to share with him your ancient treasures and your hereditary wealth, and to reign in future under him. But if you hold in contempt his power, which is fortified by innumerable battalions, it will be your own prejudice, as you will be accounted unworthy to live or to reign. And who are you that you should presume to oppose such great power? The storms and tempests of the deep subvert the purpose of our fleets, and cannot turn from the accomplishment of their settled intentions men who, by grace and honour of the elements, have never suffered injury from the awful thunders of heaven, or from the oft-repeated lightning flash. Submit therefore with all your people to the greatest of monarchs, whom the elements obey, since he is repaired in his great clemency in all that he undertakes, to spare the meek, while he overwhelms the proud." Upon hearing the message, King Edmund called one of his most trusted bishops to his side to discuss the choices ahead. The king heard him for a while and listened to the bishop's pleas to submit to Ivar. He was worried for the safety of Edmund, and so advised that they submit to Viking rule. He stared at the floor for a moment in silence, gathering his thoughts, and according to Abbot of Fleury, replied to the bishop as follows: "Bishop, I have reached a point in my life which I never had any apprehension. See, a barbarous stranger with drawn sword menaces the old occupants of my realm, and the once prosperous natives are reduced to sighs and groans and silence. Would that those who now live in dread of perishing by a bloody death might be spared to survive amid the beloved fields of their country, even though I should fall, and that they might in course and time be restored to the brightness of their former prosperity." The bishop replied, "How can you speak of survivors in the land, seeing that the enemy's sword has left scarcely one alive in the whole city? Their axes are blunted with the slaughter of your subjects, you are left without a guard, and they will bind you fast with thongs. And therefore, my sovereign, dear to me is my soul, unless you seek safety in flight, or have recourse to the ill-omened alternative of surrender, I fear the tormentors will soon arrive, and you will forfeit your life through the unholy execution of their orders. This I heartily wish and desire, replied the king, that I not be the only survivor after my beloved thanes are slain in their beds with their children and wives by these pirates. It was never my way to flee. I would rather die for my country if I need to. Almighty God knows that I will not ever turn from worship of him, nor from his love of truth. If I die, I live. After those final words to the bishop, it is then said that King Edmund, undaunted, turned to the Viking messenger and spoke. Reeking as you are with the blood of my countrymen, you might justly be doomed to death. But to speak plainly, I would follow the example of Christ my Lord, and refrain from staining my pure hands. And for his name's sake, if the needs arise, I am willing and glad to perish by your weapons. Therefore, return as fast as you can at once to your lord, and take forthwith this message to him. Son of the devil, never in this life will Edmund submit to either the heathen war leader, unless he submit first to the belief in the Saviour Christ which exists in this country. The messenger returned to Ivar Ragnarsson with the king's reply, which obviously wasn't particularly pleasing to his ear. He came and surrounded Edmund with soldiers, and ordered that he be bound and brought out. It's reported at this moment that he was savagely beaten with rods and taunted before being tied to a tree and lashed. Edmund, however, in what was now a depleted voice, still called out in refusal to submit. This further angered the invaders, and so they shot him full of arrows, filling his body with gashes and wounds and taking him beyond any state of recovery. Still a resolute voice came from the king's mouth, and so Ivar the Boneless, on the 20th of November 869, ordered that he be beheaded. Upon departing after the murder of King Edmund, the Vikings hid his decapitated head in the woods so that it couldn't be buried with his body. The locals decided to do a thorough search of the thicket, spreading out and shouting, "Where are you?" in hopes of some form of reply. Eventually they heard a voice, "Here, here, here," and followed it into an opening where a wolf sat, protecting the head of the departed king with its paws. King Edmund's body was buried in a chapel near to where he met his fate. Later his remains were taken to Bedresworth, which is the old name for modern-day Bury St Edmunds, getting its name from said burial. Interestingly, it was the Vikings of East Anglia who began the cult of King Edmund. The very people who were responsible for his death turned him into a saint, perhaps in an attempt to create a Viking-Saxon identity for the people of East Anglia. This of course goes against many opinions about St Edmund being the representation of Anglo-Saxon resistance to Viking invaders, though to be honest I prefer the idea of two communities finding harmony from the mistakes of the past. St Edmund's shrine was situated in or near the Abbey of Bury St Edmunds, and for centuries was one of the most famous and wealthy pilgrimage locations in England visited by various kings. Even after the Norman conquest in 1066 the cult of St Edmund was promoted, but unfortunately the shrine and abbey was destroyed and stripped for parts during the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII. St Edmund was actually the patron saint of England before Edward I changed it to St George in 1348. If you visit Bury St Edmunds today, you can still see many references to the Martyr King. The grounds of the old abbey, though now just ruins, have become the Abbey Gardens. Its entrance is actually the Abbey Gate, which I carved previously on this channel. There are two sculptures at roundabouts in the town, one of a wolf with a crown, and the other with King Edmund bound and full of arrows. An archaeological dig began in 2020 under the tennis courts in the Abbey Gardens, with some hope that King Edmund's remains, which were moved during the dissolution of the monasteries, may lie there. This carving took 90 hours to complete and is made from lime wood, which is basically the UK version of basswood. It measures 1 metre long, 24 centimetres wide, and it's 2 centimetres thick. The technique you see me using here is that I'm sealing the lime wood with a mixture of polyurethane and mineral spirits or white spirits in a 50-50 ratio. So after I sealed the wood by going over it twice, I'm now mixing up a wash with oil paints and mineral spirits. The first sealing is just to make the paint application a lot more easy, make it so the paint doesn't soak in too far into the wood, and so you can control the colour a little more. I always like to do a wash every time I finish a carving. It just helps to show off some of the details and add a bit more colour to the wood. The lime wood that I have, and generally lime wood and basswood and linden wood, is quite a white wood, quite pale, so quite often people will finish it with some kind of stain or colour just to bring out all the textures and the carving that you've created on the piece of wood. This is learnt from a YouTube video from a wood carver called Fred Zavadil, and he makes some incredible carvings and really knows how to control the oil paints very well. I actually bought the same oil paints that he uses just so I could try out the same technique and see if it worked for me, and so far I really love it. I've used it on a few of my carvings so far. You saw it on the Abbey Gate carving, as well as the carving of the anime character that I made. They're all using the same technique. So I'm just applying it with a brush and then taking the paint away with a piece of tissue. This is because I don't want too much of the colour to sit on the carving to start off with. I like to build it up in layers. So I'm painting quite a lot on, but then taking it off with the tissue, or sometimes with my fingers or with a different brush or something, just to kind of take the colour out of it a bit and turn it more into a stain and less like just painting acrylic straight on. And in this technique here, I'm just adding some highlights and moving it around with my fingers, because I find that helps to add a little bit extra on there. And if you push the paint in with your fingers a little bit, you can then wipe it away afterwards with a tissue, and it leaves a little bit of highlight. So we're just adding a little bit of a white highlight to the bottom of those flames there. The centre section I took quite a lot of time making, because it's one of the pivotal moments in the story and one of the most important parts of the carving, so I wanted that to be represented in the very centre and sort of draw your attention to it a little, because this is when King Edmund refuses to submit to Viking rule. So in the background there I used a leather stamp that you would usually use on leather, but I decided to use it on this just to stamp the background a bit and bring the characters a bit further forwards. And then I used the stain on it again, the same stain that I used before, but just layered it a bit more. It's the good thing about this painting technique, you can layer on top a few times just to make things a little bit darker. If you wait for the paint to dry and then layer it on, you can make it even darker, even add highlights, all this kind of stuff. So the centre section is really important because it enforces the story that we're going with, that he was a martyr, that he gave his life for his beliefs. But there are other stories out there who portray Edmund as a coward and said, rather than him defying the Vikings, he ran away. But it depends which story you go for, and I think the martyr angle is a lot more appealing and a lot more interesting. The oak tree that I've carved in the carving there is apparently at a place called Hoxton in Suffolk, and there's actually a monument there to King Edmund, which is on the very site where the oak tree once stood, where he was tied up and shot full of arrows. I actually began to paint this part green, but then soon realised that this happened on the 20th of November, so those leaves would be very much in autumn colours by then, and perhaps a lot of them would have fallen on the ground, but I decided to go with this nice orange autumn colour. So with the painting on top of the carving of 90 hours, it took around 105 hours to carve and paint and complete this project. It's one I've been planning for a long time, and I've gone through many different designs, trying to figure out how I wanted it to be set out, which parts of the story I wanted to tell. It's hard to get every single element of the story in one carving, but I tried to display the main moments and give a feeling of what things were like back then. And I took some influences on style from old medieval paintings, and particularly drawings associated with Abbot of Fleury's text that he wrote on King Edmund. The border was something that came up last minute, really. I looked at it for a while and kind of examined what I wanted to do, and looked up some Anglo-Saxon patterns from the time and some Viking patterns, and I think this sort of pyramidal repeating square type pattern around the outside would have fit in back then, with the kind of jewellery and trinkets and art that they used to make. Painting it a dark colour, I think, makes you focus more on the subject at hand. I lived near Bury almost my whole life, so going into Bury St Edmunds and seeing King Edmund referenced all over the place is really cool to see that history there, and that just made me want to bring this even more to life, really. So not only did it bring out the passion and interest I have in wood carving, but also for the local history, the local legends. And I want to say thanks to everyone on Twitch who watched me carve this whole thing live, including the painting, and for sticking around while I was doing it. I really appreciate your company and the support you've given me. Same with all you guys on YouTube, of course. I have my YouTube channel for quite a long time now, and I'm glad you're able to share this wood carving kind of journey that I'm going on, trying to express all the things I want to do and trying to improve every day. So thank you very much for hanging around, and I hope you really enjoyed this video and this piece, and I look forward to bringing another carving your way soon.